Alright, so let's go ahead and start with the posterior circulation. We're going to start off with the right vertebral artery. It goes up to become the basilar. And on the other side, you have the left vertebral artery, which again also goes up and becomes part of the basilar artery. Off the top of the basilar, you have bilateral posterior cerebral arteries. And then right below that, you have the superior cerebellar artery. Now the next major vessels we're going to draw in are the anterior inferior cerebellar arteries. And if you have anterior inferior cerebellar arteries, that means that you also have posterior inferior cerebellar arteries, one on each side. Off of each posterior inferior cerebellar artery, there is a posterior spinal artery, which supplies the posterior aspect of the spinal cord. You also have anterior spinal artery, which comes off of the vertebral artery right above where the posterior inferior cerebellar arteries come off. Next, we have the pontine penetrator, which are numerous small arteries that come off of the basilar artery and give blood supply to the pons. The paramedian branches tend to respect the midline, and then individual ones supply either the right or left paramedian region. So for the purposes of having this down cold, let's just go over everything that we just drew in. So over here we have the left vertebral artery, and obviously on the other side you will have the right vertebral artery. They then come together to give you the basilar artery. At the top of the basilar, you will have the bilateral posterior cerebral arteries. Right below that is the superior cerebellar artery. And closer to the origin of the basilar artery, you're going to have your inferior cerebellar arteries, and there are two. You have the anterior inferior cerebellar artery and the posterior inferior cerebellar artery. Now, off of the posterior inferior cerebellar artery, you will also have a posterior spinal artery. So if there's a posterior spinal artery, you will also then have an anterior spinal artery. However, if you notice here, there are two posterior spinal arteries and only one anterior spinal artery. Now, I will say that about 25% of cases, the posterior spinal artery will come off of the vertebral artery and not the posterior inferior cerebellar artery. Now also keep in mind that all of these vessels come in pairs, meaning that there's a left and a right. The only exception really is in the case of the basilar artery, as well as the anterior spinal artery. Hit the like button if you found this video to be helpful, or leave a comment to let me know how it could be improved.